few comments on Bernadette's paper, and I guess I won't comment on the others since they're not here. Maybe they'll come and we can do each individually. I will say I really think overall I did get papers from the other two presenters who are going to come, and they're all very interesting projects, and I think, you know, obviously Bernadette is working on her dissertation. I don't know about these other ones. One of them I think is a book project, and so I encourage the people to publish them. There are two papers on specific refugee or asylee groups, and then this one other paper that was kind of much different. It looked at a new category of refugees and asylees, displacement due to development, so development-induced displacement. I think I'll just give a couple of general comments, and then I'll go to specific things on your paper, Bernadette, on your presentation. I think we can discuss belonging. This is the theme of the conference, right? Belonging in terms of migrants' experiences of belonging and or exclusion, and we can think of it in the place of origin, the place of destination, or the middle country, right? So the refugees who wound up in Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana before they come, right? So there's a lot of different contexts that we need to take into account here. And I think it's particularly interesting in terms of what you were discussing of people's context of how they compare where they are now, right? They had a different point of comparison in Liberia. They had a different point of comparison if they lived in a camp in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire. And then they may have a different point of comparison by visiting relatives in other cities in the US, right? And apparently they don't go to Queens or whatever, right? So it's fascinating. Then we can also talk about refugees and asylees, I think, in the literature, right, and in the research. How do they belong, or are they excluded from the category of migrant? And to me, that's what was really interesting about unfortunately, the person who's not here on the development-induced displacement, right, is how is that incorporated into this category of forced migration? And he's really arguing that at least I think he's arguing that it's a separate sort of thing. I've done a lot of research on both forced migrants and voluntary migrants, right? And I kind of don't like this dichotomy. I really like to think in terms of spectrums, especially when we're talking about forced migration, I think it's important, as Bernadette points out, we need to recognize that refugees do have agency, of course to varying degrees at different points in time, but labor migrants also have constraints, right, and also have push and pull factors, and also have barriers. So I really don't, I like the idea of the spectrum. All right, so that's my general comments, and then I obviously have a bit of a bias here because I'm on Bernadette's committee. I should give full disclosure, and I think it's a wonderful project. And we also did a small pilot project in the community together with a few interviews. What did we do? 15 interviews. And so I have some context for this. I've been to the community and done some interviews there myself. But I do want to know a lot more about the project, and I think a lot of my comments probably are elsewhere in your dissertation, so take that with a grain of salt, but I would like to know more, and I think you've told me this, but I think the audience may be interested to know why did you choose to do unstructured interviews, and a bit more about your methodology in terms of how you locate people and so forth. I think that part is very interesting in terms of its impact and what you wind up finding out. Your data come primarily from the Liberian community, but I wonder if we could benefit from perspective of others in the community as well. And I know there's a lot to ask, right, for a dissertation, but maybe it's a further project. So we know what Liberians think, but what are the perceptions of Liberians, right? And I was kind of hoping for that because you brought up all of this issue about how Staten Island is very different, right? And I know that you've read this in the media and so forth, so at least even those kinds of accounts would be very fascinating to see how does the rest of Staten Island view having this Liberian community in Staten Island, right? And does that affect the Liberians, right, in terms of is there racism or prejudice against the community, or is it seen as a good thing, diversity and multiculturalism, right? What's going on there? Staten Island is incredibly unique. I wanted to know more about this, I guess the politics, right? Because you showed, right, from the presidential election, they voted mainly for McCain, right? So we assume it's conservative, but is it like a New York City conservatism, or is it a real hardcore right-wing conservatism, right? What's going on, and how does that relate to their reaction to the foreign-born and these waves of migrants coming in, right? I really like the focus that you put on refugees versus other immigrants. But even in this case, I think the non-refugees were refugees, right? So they may not have accessed the services, they may not have found that status. And I believe the legal clinic that we were affiliated with was actually helping people who had not actually gained that refugee status but who were eligible, right? So they didn't actually know that they had that eligibility. The resettlement process, I think, is really complex. And so I'm looking forward to reading more about how all of this stuff happened, how people came to Staten Island, because not all of them came there immediately. They may have wound up in Philadelphia first or something like that, right? And why is it that some of them gained refugee status and some didn't? And how did those who didn't have it get here, right? So those kinds of things are interesting to me. And then this idea of home. You talk about that they've made it a home away from home. Do they see that as home in a permanent sense, right? Do they see themselves, I'm here, I'm settled, this is my home now, right? Or is it more of like, well, eventually I want to go back to Liberia, or eventually I'm going to do this type of thing? I would be interested to know what people think. Again, much of this is probably way beyond this particular presentation. I like how you talk about claim making, and unfortunately I wish the other presenter on Pakistani asylum seekers was here, because it really interacts with what she was talking about identity formation. And so the idea is the claim making a process of identity formation and change, right? Is it just claim making for the community, or does it change how they identify themselves, right? Do they now identify as something else? And I don't know what that label could be, right? It could be Liberian American, it could be I'm from Park Hill, I'm from this, right? Rather than being I'm a Liberian refugee or something, right? I don't know what that is. But it would be really interesting to see how does that change, and how does that relate to the perceptions by those other groups that I was mentioning? And how does that relate to the resettlement process? How does it differ for people who had different processes, right? And how does it relate to whether they have, where they are on the trajectory to citizenship or something like that, right? I know many of them are not yet, but they have the option, right, if they are refugees. And I really like the focus on agency. I'm very partial to that. And particularly in this community, I think the entrepreneurial nature of the Liberians is really fascinating. I mean, the fact that they have gotten 5013C for their NGOs, for their one-person NGO, or whatever, is really amazing. How did they learn to do that, right? Like, where did they find this information? I mean, I wouldn't even know how to do that, right? So it's amazing, right? That, and I'm a native-born American, right? Like, it's just fascinating to think, how did they find these things out? And also I like this positive nature, right? You're definitely pushing a more positive view, right? The fact that they compare the transport to other places, right? We are biased, right, in our view of it because we're used to the subway coming in all the time or whatever, right? Maybe they're comparing it to Liberia or Ghana, right, where they had very little, they had to take a trotro or something, right? There's like a whole lot of comparisons going on there again. But I wonder if it's a little too positive, right? And I kind of like to see a balance. Because you mentioned all this crime and drugs and gangs and is there racism, right? That was left open. And several people mentioned this, I know, in our own interviews, right? And so I'm about being really worried that they needed to be at school right on time to pick up their kids, right? Because they don't want them getting involved with the bad elements, right, in the community. People said this exactly. And so how does, I don't know, I'd like to see some balance of, you know, yes, it's home, but there are these other things that are negative, right, and that they don't like. Although they're making ways around it, right? And I think that's what your point is. So I think that's all. I think, but it's a really, really good project, and I'm looking forward to reading more. Yeah. We can discuss belonging. This is the theme of the conference, right? Belonging in terms of migrants' experiences of belonging and or exclusion. And we can think of it in the place of origin of people to publish them. There are 2 papers on specific refugee or asylee groups. And then this one other paper that was kind of much different. It looked at a new category of refugees and asylees. Displacement papers from the other 2 presenters who are going to come, and they're all very interesting projects. And I think, you know, obviously Bernadette is working on her dissertation. I don't know about these other ones. One of them I think is a book project, and so I encourage you to give a few comments on Bernadette's paper, and I guess I won't comment on the others since they're not here. Maybe they'll come and we can do each individually. I will say I really think overall I did get paid due to development, so development-induced displacement. I think I'll just give a couple of general comments and then I'll go to specific things on your paper, Bernadette, on your presentation.